The most independent academic media publication, which reaches millions of people in America, just gave a platform to an imbecile named Clay Travis, who also happens to have a podcast, a very popular one. So the title of this is Sports Should Unify, Not Divide Us. Perfectly unobjectionable. The problem is that this is the same man who is calling out WNBA player Angel Reese every other day, challenging her to a one-on-one game, mocking her rebounds, and so on and so forth. So you've got somebody who's built up an audience based on dividing people. Now, that's actually not unusual. If you remember, back in the day, Cassius Clay became Muhammad Ali, divided an entire nation, went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Around that time, you also had Jim Brown, you had Lou Alcindor, and so on and so forth, who of course became Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, etc., etc. It wasn't just that. You also had Fernando Valenzuela. You had so many people that would introduce not just athleticism to the American people, but a lot of other things. Fernando was actually Mayan, and so he wasn't part of that Spanish invasion or colonization that was part of Mexico. So you've got a lot of different sort of features happening in sports, particularly on the California side. If you go down to San Jose State, you've got a Black Power salute right there on campus with Carlos and so on and so forth. So sports has always been a platform. And what's really problematic is that you've got this independent academic institution not able to understand why it's not a good idea to invite somebody who's an imbecile and who's flat out contradicting what he's saying. And you don't have that problem in Asia. So you go to Singapore, where for the most part, the media goes through SPH. SPH Media is a de facto state-owned, I shouldn't say state-owned, state-controlled or state-influenced empire. And so you pick up the Straits Times, that dominant newspaper, it's not going to have anything like this. They're never going to feature an idiot. So why is it that, and by the way, Singapore, of course, has the most successful political system and political just nominees in the 21st century. It's the most successful city-state, or just a state in the entire world at this point in time. It's got $1 trillion in assets almost. It's got no debt. It's friends with China and the United States, and so on and so forth. That's not an accident, by the way. It got along with both of its neighbors, neither of which are Chinese majority. The state itself is a Chinese majority state. So again, none of this is an accident. If you have good leadership, you have to really figure out what kind of a system you want. And a lot of people in America and in the West misunderstand censorship. So the censorship that happens in the East is designed to eliminate this kind of a person from having a platform. What he says is, let me tell you exactly. He starts off by criticizing another black woman, probably the most successful coach in probably WNBA history, Staley, who's just an amazing. It's just sort of like criticizing John Wooden, to be honest with you. It's the equivalent of doing that. And this person is not a professional athlete. He's just a talker, basically. And, the thing that he starts off with is that this coach, Staley, was asked about, whether or not biological men should be able to compete in the WNBA. And now, the response was, as a black woman who's been, who knows that black women have been excluded from a lot of different sports, that there's been segregation, the instinct is just towards inclusivity. But nobody in America has actually given the proper answer to that question, which is it should be on a case-by-case basis. Obviously, there's a difference between, say, a biological male who's 5 feet tall and who's under the strict supervision of a doctor taking estrogen to get the testosterone levels down to whatever medically agreed threshold, et cetera, et cetera. All of that should be done on a case-by-case basis. That's obviously different from, say, Shaquille O'Neal, who wants to go ahead and participate in women's sports. And a lot of that comes down to the fact that it should be a local decision made by respected people within the local community. And what's happening now in the United States is that those kinds of decisions are being sort of enforced, I suppose, or dictated from a top-down system. And that's not what the United States is about. The United States is really about local control. And the real problem we're having right now is that ultimately we're not able to do these things by case basis because the federal government has intruded upon local institutions spectacularly. And quite frankly, this really comes down to an issue between someone's doctor and, what kind of threshold they want to, establish for the testosterone levels and so on and so forth. And so, you go back and forth, and again, this is just a very logical answer. You don't want to automatically exclude people just, just because, it's not a good idea to have an automatic exclusion. And the question is, who is going to be making those decisions? And right now, it's going to be the United States Supreme Court. But what should be happening is that, and by the way, that's not going to be any sort of harbinger of clarity. Remember, when the United States Supreme Court was asked to define obscenity, one of the justices said, "I know it when I see it." Well, it's kind of the same thing here, isn't it? And you don't need the Supreme Court to be dictating from the top down. So, you really want local people to get these things done. The problem is that, we don't have a lot of people who are at the local level who are respected enough to basically issue these kinds of decisions. And I mentioned John Wooden. Remember, John Wooden, there was a vote when Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was coming in whether or not you could dunk in college basketball. And if I'm not mistaken, John Wooden effectively voted with everybody else in a way that harmed the ability of Lou Alcindor to go in and score 100 points a game. And he did that, again, nobody criticized him for that, right? Because he's just known as somebody who's honest. And so when that vote came down, if John Wooden said it was good, it was okay, then it was okay. And people just kind of moved on. We don't have those kinds of people in America anymore. We don't have those kinds of, I guess you could call them good Christians. People who really care about society in a way that's both compassionate and that has some method of fairness to it. And don't get me wrong, Kareem criticized John Wooden, but he always respected him. That's the key, is you have somebody who is fundamentally fair. We don't have that many people in America like that. You can't name anybody, really. And that's what sports is really supposed to do. It's supposed to elevate people with that kind of gravitas. And Don Staley, the guy that this idiot, Clay Travis, is criticizing, is in fact one of those people that is sort of beyond reproach. So what's happening here in America when you study this country's downfall and the rise of China is not only this sort of censorship model that effectively shuts out idiots in the East. It's also the fact that the West has a more variegated system, but it has been unable to elevate, say, somebody as good as a John Wooden or a Jimmy Carter on the Christian side. And at the same time, the last good Christian I can think of in politics at the national level would be Jimmy Carter. That was, 50 years ago or something like that? There was one guy in Texas. He seems to be okay, but I can't even remember his name. So again, the system is not elevating people who are as good as the people in the past. Same thing, by the way, I mentioned Christians. I don't want to pick on anybody. The same thing with the Muslims. There is no successor to Muhammad Ali. There is no successor to Malcolm X. There is no successor even on, let's say to Baldwin, who is not Muslim, by the way, right? They're just not producing. This country, right, is no longer producing these kinds of people. And the same police department that elevated Muhammad Ali in Louisville is responsible for a no-knock shooting that murdered somebody, who was innocent. She was sleeping on her couch and her boyfriend was there who had criminal activity, but she ended up getting shot, if I'm not mistaken. That's Louisville. Would that have happened in Muhammad Ali's time? I don't know. But we know that it definitely wasn't publicized. So we have all these things going together. And the other problem is that Americans don't realize that, yes, we have a three-branched government, but, legislative, executive, judicial. But all these guys were supposed to be kept in check by the fourth estate, which is journalism. So the journalists were supposed to keep people in check. And the journalists were effectively outsiders outside of insiders. And we don't have any good journalists in this country either. We don't have a Murrow. We don't have a Bill Moyers. We don't have anybody. Studs Terkel. They're all gone. There are no successors. So what ends up happening is even the most independent institutions, right, that literally have in their, code of their charter some sort of mandate to be civil, they invite an imbecile who's not civil. to their campus to give a speech. And so you've got this, variegated system that's just not doing a good job enforcing the kind of consistency that we used to see in America. The people that were compassionate, that saw religion not as a way to increase, tax-free real estate and take over local police departments. They really did see it as a way to elevate themselves to a higher standard. We don't have that anymore in the United States. And so I mentioned the Christians because that's the dominant religion in the United States. And so if you really want to go somewhere, you have to just realize that we're now we talked about being in a post-history world, right? And that was after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We are now into an abyss of apoliticism, where the American empire just doesn't believe in history anymore. It just believes that it just sort of popped up, and God has blessed the country, and that's just not true. Even the Star of David is actually comes from an Eastern religion. Everything in this country, the word black, comes from the Spanish word for negro. That, of course, became a different word and then became black. Nothing here is original. Nothing. And this country just doesn't want to accept that. So it's decided that, without context, it's decided that it's just going to march forward and impose its own version of history upon everyone else, which is, of course, not being accepted. And that is going to having consequences everywhere. And to the point where, again, you have this nobody, this Clay Travis nobody, criticizing, I think, the most successful women's WNBA coach in history, who's also, again, pretty much beyond reproach. How do you get there? And the only way you get there when you have a white nobody who claims to be Christian, I'm sure. Maybe he's not. I'm not sure what he is. I don't really care to look him up at all. But he is from Tennessee, effectively, which is in the South, which is known for Christianity and so on and so forth. You've got this system that just doesn't seem to have any lines. That is also not necessarily unexpected when you have a country that dropped an A-bomb and an H-bomb on civilian populations in Japan, dropped napalm on children in Vietnam in an effort to split the country into a Buddhist North and an American Christian South. A Catholic South is really what they were going for. You have a country that is going to be remembered as the new, I suppose, the successor to Nazi Germany. And I don't know any other way out of this except to try to teach people history, which is too late for this generation, right? They've all gone to the same schools with the same textbooks, and all of them have failed them. The teachers have failed them, the lawyers have failed them, and now even the independent media has failed them as well. So the East, by virtue of not making these kinds of mistakes, which of course have also caused them not to have as much creativity. I mentioned Singapore, their most successful writer is in the United States. Can't even go back to Singapore because didn't perform the mandatory military service, from what I remember. So again, the East is just rising up steadily by virtue of just not making these kinds of really, really imbecilic, stupid mistakes.